Next, I feel we're kind of now really getting into the real juice. I think it's quite clear from the discussions we already had that language models, that's a very essential part of any discussion on Nordic.AI, and that's what we're going to talk about next. And I will first introduce my good colleague Sven, who is Chief Technology and Data Officer in Schibsted. He's also the chair of this initiative that was mentioned, Norw.AI, at the which is a collaboration with the NTNU University in Trondheim. He will give an introduction, and then he will introduce the next speakers, but we will hear about the status on this from Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and then we will round it off with a concrete case from the media industry, presented by also my colleague Agnes. So with that, Sven, I'll just hand it over to you.
So how many of you have kids in school age, or grandchildren in school age? Some of you actually do, right? Okay.
Don't be rude.
So maybe you have noticed that they have become quite reliant on actually using ChatGPT. In many ways, I guess they are the forerunners of using these technologies. And if they don't, then you maybe should push them a bit to start using it, actually. So, I mean, during the last year, ChatGPT has been the go-to tool for a lot of kids, both in elementary school, but also as students, as you see, where they use it for all different kinds of purposes. I actually share an account with my daughter at NTNU, and she's a first-year student at engineering, and I can see what she's asking ChatGPT about, and that's a lot about math, actually. As you know, it willingly throws out a lot of explanations that sometimes are really true, but sometimes absolutely are false. And they use it for all different kinds of purposes, and I would like to say that in many ways it's becoming their personal tutor or a personalized textbook in the way they actually use these tools today. Here you see some examples behind us here, where you can see, if you were able to read it, that they are absolutely throwing out lots of stuff that is not correct. I think, first of all, it matters for us as parents, but it also for our societies, where and how our children are getting their knowledge. And that's why governments, through all years, have been very thoughtful about what content is in our textbooks in our schools. That's a very important part of actually setting a culture and framing a language. And we want them to reflect our values, right? That's what we want them to do. So what about these new models? What do they actually do? We know that ChatGPT easily makes up stuff, and the example to the left shows that. And we know that the values in these models are set in a very, very short diameter from California. That's where it's actually are aligned in terms of what values it's there. And I think that Jill Walker-Redbert at the University of Bergen, she sums it up very well. ChatGPT is multilingual, but it is monocultural. That's the situation. The second reason I mentioned this example is that it shows how large language models have become an integrated part of our digital infrastructure, and it's happened in just 1 year. In just 1 year. And as a digital infrastructure, our platforms, if you prefer that word, we see that these numerous services are built on top of the language model in all kinds of flavors. Who of you are following the web page that is called There is an AI for that? Well, very few of you. You should. Because if you do that, you will see how many applied services on top of language models and, of course, the image models that are being built and cranked out as commercial offerings that people are using. So there is an AI for that. If you work with AI, you should really look into that service as well. Language models have become the foundational for services, and it's going to revolutionize how we live and how we work and how we learn, etc., etc. And the big question is, should we entrust the development of these foundational infrastructures solely to a few American corporations? I don't think we should. And instead, we need to join forces in the Nordics to actually make this infrastructure together. And we need our own foundational language model based on Nordic languages, and they have to be trained with our value sets. models that can be used by the public sector, by businesses, universities to build new services targeted specifically to people in our countries. And this is vast, as a very, very large exercise, and I think that all of us that have worked with building, you will hear more about it afterwards, see how enormous undertakings there is to make language models with the current technology that we do have. So fortunately, we have very good and promising initiatives within this space, and we'll surely hear from 3 of them. We have the Norwegian language model Norw.GPT by Norw.AI, which is a joint effort by NTNU, University of Oslo, and University of Stavanger. We have GPT-3, which it is called. Magnus is going to talk about that. That's from AI Sweden. And finally, we're going to have Thaulow.AI from Finland that is building a large language model based on 15 different languages in Europe, and it's a commercial direction of doing this. And all of them are aspiring to be foundational large language models that others can build services on top of. Then the question is, why are these undertakings so crucial? And there are 3 reasons for it. Firstly, we believe that the language models that are primarily trained on Nordic languages, mixed with some other languages, are going to perform better than the American models. That's the hypothesis. And if you look at ChatGPT, when we look at Norwegian text, we think it's about, GPT-4 is about 0.1% is the amount of Norwegian text in that corpus. That's what we estimate. To be able to do that, we need content from all parts of society. We need chats, we need news articles, we need novels, we need governmental documentation, we need all kinds representing our languages in the societies. I'll get a bit back to that. Then, secondly, as small nations, we must have control over our infrastructure. And that was mentioned earlier on today, but it includes developing large language models that serve our societies well, and that can be basis for innovation. And it's become really, I would say now, we rapidly understand that these language models are being fundamental in services that are being deployed all over the society and in industries. Kristin mentioned in Schibsted, we're having language models plugged into our services left, right, and center. We don't have an overview over how many places they are already integrated within 1 year. And we don't know how important these language models are going to be. We think they're going to be super important, just like cloud infrastructure or mobile networks. And if you think with that aspect into these large language models, then you need to have some kind of control over them. They can be weaponized. We know that, if you align a language model according to values that are not according to Nordic values, they might not answer the things you want them to answer. And if you, God forbid, gets into, for example, the educational system, that is not a good situation if that's going to be one of the key places where our students and young people are actually going to absorb content. And that's the third I would like to go to, and that's the language models that generally reflect the value sets of the Nordic societies. And we really have to then train them on our value sets. And the way we do that can be different ways. There are constitutional AI models, that's our theory out there, and there are the more traditional way that's been done now lately in the existing language models out there. Well, then to build these models, it requires a lot, and I mentioned it. And the next presenters are going to tell more about that and confirm what I'm saying right now. First of all, we need specialized competence. And I think we all feel that within the Nordics, we do have very good competency on our ability to do this. There aren't that many, but we have the competency in need to do this. And right now, I wouldn't say this is research anymore. This is engineering. This is really getting this shit done. Not starting to make, foundational research about how doing language models. It's really about making these models and get them out there in production so that people can actually start to use them. And I see quite a few of you that have been contacting us with wanting to actually use these foundational models already now. So we need to get this out in production. Then we need enormous amounts of text. with the local languages to train the models on. And this is more tricky, and it's becoming more and more tricky every week. We need every part of society to contribute to text, and I'll just give one example that we thought was very obvious. To get access to Norwegian sources of laws, the laws themselves, the verdicts, I mean, we're close to the faculty here, legislative history, and so on. Shockingly, in Norway, that is not publicly available digital data. It's actually the Supreme Court that actually said it's not, the Supreme Court themselves. So we're not able to get what we call instrumental content for the democracy and deploy it into a foundational regional large language model. It's pretty shocking. But if we're going to meet that a lot of different places, it's going to be difficult. And then finally, we need massive amounts of data processing power. And the language models that you're going to see presented here afterwards have been made on the biggest supercomputers that we have. It's Idun in Trondheim. Then we have Berzelius in Sweden. And then we have the absolutely largest one, the European HPC, AMD-based Lumi in Finland. And then, when all of these models are done, then we need to understand how are we actually going to offer these out to the public sector in a commercial way. Do we need to train them 2 times a year? It's going to cost us 80 million times every time we do a build of these models with existing technology, so it's quite costly. Who are going to pay for it? Will they be offered through APIs? Are we just going to give the models away and all the weights? All of these things are things we haven't really figured out how to do. So we hope that when we get this done, that the school books of our kids are going to be based on foundational and aligned Nordic models, and not that they're only going to use ChatGPT. We're not going to compete with ChatGPT, but maybe the Nordic publishers of educational books will make specialized LLMs for kids that they can use when they try to learn things in school, and not only use ChatGPT. So by that, I'm going to leave it to Magnus, Atle, and Jussi. That's going to tell a bit about how far we've come in our 3 countries. And then after that, Agnes from EAB is going to say something about why these models are important in a practical example of how we actually do it. So by that, first is Magnus from AI Sweden.
Thank you so much, Sven. My name is Magnus Sahlgren. I'm head of research for natural language understanding at AI Sweden. And I'm here to talk about an initiative that we have been driving a couple of years now, which is called GPT-SWE. And it has been about building the first large language model for Swedish data in particular, but by extension, as it happened, for all of the Nordic countries. And I'll speak a little bit about how we built that. But a little bit of background. So in the Nordic region, we have a strong tradition and a long tradition in language technology. And we were also quite early on in Sweden to do the technology shift with a new breed of language models. And already back in 2019, we started a project called Language Models for Swedish Authorities, where we tried to get language models out into production systems in the public sector in Sweden. And that has been a very successful project. Most, if not all, current language models in Swedish have some relation to this project. We have seen significant uptake in the public sector with regards to Swedish language models. There are examples of government agencies that integrate language models in their production systems. But of course, in the middle of that project, the era of large language models began. So this was in the summer of 2020, we saw GPT-3 being released, which was on a scale that we haven't seen before. And we immediately realized that this was a disruptive technology and we needed to be part of that development in Sweden, and that's where we started to think about how can we do that in a small country on the northern hemisphere, in a peripheral part of the world. What we did was to build a research team at AI Sweden, and I will explain why we chose that as a platform. with the sole purpose of building large language models for Sweden and for the Nordic region. And we have already done that, and there are a family of models that I will talk about soon, and I will also talk about our next steps. But quite important for us was to find a platform that is not research, and I want to be clear, building large language models is not a research problem. Don't put money into research and expect that you will get artifacts back from that. This is a development problem. So we need to focus on building artifacts. We do have the competence, we have a long history in research, we know how to do it. But we need to find an environment where we can actually realize that. And in Sweden, there is only one environment, and that's AI Sweden. And the reason why that works is because we're a collaborative platform. So we have partners from all sectors of society. There is academia, there is public, private, large, small companies. Many of you, or at least some of you here, are a part of this. And very importantly, we have funding from the state via Vinnova, which is a Swedish innovation agency. And they have been very forthcoming and foreseeing with regards to language technology and language models in general. So by moving the natural language understanding research team to this platform, we could build a consortium of other organizations that supported the idea of building these type of very large-scale AI models in Sweden. And we collaborate broadly. We are very open to collaborations, and in this case, we collaborated with these wonderful institutes, and you have already heard about WASP. Our collaboration with WASP also meant that we got access to infrastructure, and in our case, which we already heard, it's the Berzelius infrastructure in Linköping at the National Supercomputer Center. It's a superpod full of wonderful GPUs that you can train large-scale AI models on. The only thing that we couldn't find partnerships around was data. And I want to be completely transparent here. We did invite the National Library to be part of this project, but they were not willing or able to be part of this. And if I can say something to you policymakers, please, we need to open our national libraries. It is a unique resources. And this is the only way we are going to provide these foundation models in the Nordic region. We need to get access to all of this data. And you need to make us, to make that happen. But so what we did instead was to spend half a year or so just collecting open sources on the internet. And thankfully enough, there are open sources on the internet. The National Library here in Oslo provides open data in the Norwegian Colossal Corpus that we have used, for example. And we have used publicly available data in Sweden, government websites, etc. And our initial idea was to build a Swedish model, but there is not enough data in only Swedish, so we built a North Germanic model. So that's Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, and Faroese. Very small amount of Faroese data. In addition to English and programming code, because that makes the model robust and able to handle instructions. We call this the Nordic Pile. Since we are in Europe, we are not able to share this data due to legal restrictions, and please, this is also a policy question. We need to be able to share data and collaborate on this. So using that data, we have trained a series of models, and now we're going to go through the formula here. I'm just kidding, we're not going to do that. Now, focus on that. We've built a series of models, all the way from very tiny ones that you can run on a laptop, all the way up to 40 billion parameters, which is large by even international standards. And we have also produced a set of instruction-tuned versions of the model. That doesn't tell you very much, but it's a step towards model behavior like ChatGPT, so models that can follow instructions. One of the challenges that we have in the Nordic region is we don't really know how to evaluate our models. How do we know if our models behave better than the ones that are publicly available through APIs? And this is something that we have formed collaborations with our Nordic partners, both with Jon and Jussi, to build Nordic evaluation data sets. When we compare our model to other international available models, we look at the performance in language modeling, for example, which is simply just the task that it's been trained for. And of course, our model is the best one available. It's not a surprise, but this just shows it. And we can also evaluate our models on English, because there we have test benchmarks, and the line graph there shows that it's on par with GPT-3, even though our model is much, much smaller. And I should be honest and say that this doesn't necessarily translate into behavior in applications, but at least it confirms that we haven't screwed up the development process. And if you look internationally, this is a compilation from Hugging Face about available models worldwide. GPT-3 is up there in a blue box. The blue and green boxes are models that are available for use, for you to download and use. The fact that it's a blue box here means that it's available under certain restrictions. So you can download it if you're a researcher in the Nordic region, and you can do research on it. We're now opening up the model for commercial use, so you can build up applications and commercial services, because we have received that feedback that it's necessary. And we hope that the box will turn green very soon. So we have already produced this set of foundation models for the Nordic region, and if you're interested in building your own, you can start from our model and take that as a basic resource. What we're doing now is we're taking the next steps. I think it's great that we have these national initiatives that try to build language models, but if we look at the state of the art right now, it's not only language models, it's multimodal, general capacity models. That's where we are aiming to go right now, and we are currently planning this, and we have already started to draft this research direction, and we have also started to build more international collaborations around that. So we have a couple of ongoing, really large European collaborations, some of which Jon and others maybe here are part of. And we are really open to collaboration. If I can just give one message here, is that we are in a unique position in the Nordic region. I would say our languages are basically the same, right? So if we can pool resources, we do have the competence. We need the data, and we need the infrastructure, and then we can actually provide value here. So collaboration is absolutely necessary. We have also tried to foster Nordic collaboration by putting up a Discord server and collecting AI researchers all throughout the Nordic region. Some of you are already part of that. If you're interested in a little bit more technical discussions about AI, you can go to that link and sign up. We have basically the entire Nordic AI community on there, and we try to share news and things that are happening. So please keep in mind, we need policy to support us, we need to collaborate better, and it's not a research problem, it's a development problem. And by that, I end. Thank you.
Here we go. So my name is Gulla. I'm in charge of this research center called Norw.AI. This is an SFI, meaning this is a center partly funded by the Research Council, but it also includes a number of companies, research institutes, and universities. Now, the main topic is the NordGPT family of language models. But it's fair to say that we have spent quite some time on building language models in Norway over the last 2-3 years. So this is not the only model that we're working on. So if you look at the models that we have in Norway these days, you see that some of them are of the generative type, meaning the ones that can generate new content. Some of them are more for classification purposes, the non-generative models. And some of them are trained from scratch, what we call the pre-trained models, and some of them are fine-tuned on top of existing models. And of course, most of the models that you see used today, they are really in the lower left corner here. We take an international model and we fine-tune it for our particular purposes. A lot of them are used there, and they're used for classification purposes. Now, what we've seen lately is also that some people have started training, fine-tuning existing models into the generative landscape. And we see Router, for example, with the Llama model, where they're using then the meta model as a starting point and fine-tuning that model with local data. The national library has done the same thing with a T5 model, using an MT5 model, an international model, and fine-tuning it with data from the national library. These are generative models, but they are not built from scratch. But they are highly useful and they are very good models. Now, AI Sweden and Norw.AI, we are in this area where we build the models from scratch. And there too, you have two options. You can either build the non-generative models from scratch, and that's where you find these BERT models typically, the Norbert family from the University of Oslo and the NB BERT family from the National Library. Again, these are excellent models, and they perform very well on classification tasks. In Trondheim, we are currently pursuing the upper right corner, which is then the pre-trained models that are of the generative type. And the Norw.GPT model is a family of models where the biggest is 23 billion parameters. The National Library has a model that is comparable, what they call the NB-GPT-J model of 6 billion parameters. We've been looking into that model, and it is actually quite similar to what we also have. So if you look at that picture, you see that there are at least 3 communities in Norway that are actively building language models today, and they have done a great job. The National Library, the University of Oslo, and then NTNU as part of Norw.AI. Now, I will spend the rest of this presentation going into the Norw.GPT family, but that is mostly because I know that one the best, but also because of the issues in this development is also relevant for the other models, of course. Now, the Norw.GPT family of models, we've done the same thing as AI Sweden, started with rather small models, 300 million parameters, and then gradually going up until the model we have available now that is 23 billion parameters. And we plan to move on with one bigger model, around 40 by summer 2024. So these are foundation models, and they include both bokmål and nynorsk at the moment. You can easily see that when you test the model. If you ask a question in bokmål, you get a reply in bokmål. If you ask the same question in nynorsk, you get a reply in nynorsk. So somehow the model is able to distinguish between the two, even though we have mixed all the content together. Now, if you look at the size of these models, it is, of course, not at all comparable to what you find internationally. GPT-4 with 1 trillion parameters, ChatGPT with 355 billion parameters. These are much bigger models. So you might ask yourself, why do we either bother starting building these models that are smaller and more restricted in a linguistic sense? But of course, it does make sense, because if you look at the GPT-3 model, it contains more than 90 languages. And the number of words of Norwegian is only like 212 million. So the Norwegian content is fairly limited in the GPT-3 model. What does that mean? It's 0.1% of the total data set. When we are now planning the 40 billion model in Norway, we're going to have more than 30 billion Norwegian words. So it's a totally different scale in terms of Norwegian content. And that means something in terms of the state of affairs that the model knows about, the linguistic variation in Norwegian that the model will be aware about, and also the values and the standards that is somehow, penetrating the model from the textual content. So Sven talked about that earlier. Because we have all this Norwegian content, we believe that this model will, to a larger extent, reflect Norwegian values and standards. Now, I said this is part of the Norw.AI Research Center, and that is true. So the activities on NLP and language models is a collaboration between NTNU, the University of Oslo, and the University of Stavanger. In addition to that, we have a number of companies that are very much interested in this topic. Schibsted is one of them, but also DNB, Telenor, Sparebanken, and also other ones. So all of these companies involved in this research center, they do realize that language models are getting more and more important, and they are very interested in starting to use these models. And that's a very good thing for us. We see that some companies use international models, like Cognite, for example, since they are dealing mostly with English documents. But many of these companies here, they are really looking forward to having real Norwegian language models. Now, how is this done in practice? Well, the first thing, when you build these language models, we need the infrastructure, the compute. And as Sven said, we're using the Idun supercomputer cluster in Trondheim This is one of the most powerful computers in Norway, but it's fair to say that we're hitting the roof already now. So with 23 billion parameter models, we are spending something like 3 to 4 months training this model with our supercomputer. We're now in the process of upgrading the computer, but this is a serious problem for all language model training in Norway. We just don't have enough compute. Except for the compute, we need to choose an architecture. We chose the GPT architecture, and we've been spending the last 2-3 years building competence on training models. As part of that, we have also been talking a lot to AI Sweden, since they are ahead of us. Now, the way we have done that is that we build a data set, which is also a rather complicated matter. We have mostly Norwegian data, 70% Norwegian, then some Swedish, Danish, and English. We have some data that comes from Schibsted. We have other data that is open, and we are struggling to get enough data. After training the base model, we do also some fine-tuning for the model to understand how to generate summaries, for example, since that was a particular need of Schibsted. Fine-tuning and instruction tuning so you can answer questions is another thing that we have spent some time on. And there, too, we lack Norwegian data. So to a large extent, we have been forced to translate English data sets for the instruction tuning part. And that is, of course, suboptimal. Then there's an alignment process, the way we align the models to human expectations. We are pulling in human feedback for the ranking of various text fragments to see what is expected, what would the humans prefer out of the language model. This is not so much about getting more data, but it's more about having access to people that can do this job for us, ranking this text for the model. That is a rather costly process, and we know that OpenAI used these Kenyan workers for $2 an hour. We have been using students, but they are not as cheap, so this is complicated. And there's a security layer at the end that we also like to add to these models to make sure that we try to avoid some of this toxic language and the bias and all these other problems that get out of these models. So training a model is one part of it, but there are a number of steps afterwards before you have a useful model that you can start putting into operation. And all of these steps are problematic. What are the plans in Norw.AI now? Well, we do have these models that are down here. They are basically used for research at the moment, and they're mostly based on open data. The first thing we're going to do is to release one model for commercial use, and that will then be totally based on open data, and it will be rather limited in size, up until like 6 billion parameters. While doing that, we are in a rather complex process talking to the publishing companies and also the media companies about getting access to copyright-protected material. We do believe that these models will get better if we have access to better content and more content, but it is a complicated process. The publishing companies, they are looking for some kind of compensation. It's all about restricted use. What can you use these models for? What can you not use them for? How do we somehow make sure that we also respect the content owners? So this is a rather time-consuming process, but we believe this is also a necessary way to go to get models of the necessary quality and size. We could go for books that are more than 70 years old, of course, but then we wouldn't then really be able to answer any questions about things that are going on at the moment. Magnus said something about collaboration. Collaboration is, of course, important to us as well. So we really do want to collaborate with other institutions, both academic institutions and industrial companies. We are also reaching out to international communities, and there's an EU project now, Trust LLM, that AI Sweden is also part of, that is going to spend time working on Germanic language models. And it makes sense to do that because it turns out that there is quite some transfer effect between related languages. If we can build a good data set for Swedish, that data set will be highly useful for Norwegian as well, and the other way around. Same thing, do we have fantastic data sets for German, Dutch, Danish, etc.? These data will be extremely useful also for Norwegian. So we have partners from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Netherlands, and Germany, and the whole thing is actually coordinated by Sweden. What are the problems that we see now? There are some problems that need to be addressed. One problem is access to the necessary infrastructure. We are short of compute resources. And one thing is for the training itself. The other thing, what happens after training when these models need to be hosted with an API. And there too, we are short of compute resources. So this is unfortunately a problem that not only we suffer from, but all the communities working on language models in Norway these days. We can use Lumi in Finland, but we really would need better compute resources in Norway. Second problem is access to copyright-protected material. We believe that that is necessary to get these models good enough. Right now, we are negotiating with a number of companies about getting access to this data, and it has turned out to be a lot more difficult than what we expected. Companies are positive in general, but there are complications. And when it comes to the publishing industry, for example, it's not just about the companies, it's about every individual author that has to give access to this data for us. And the last moment here, the last point, we can more or less support nynorsk because we have a lot of bokmål in our data set. These languages are related, so we see this transfer effect very clearly. But when it comes to very low resource languages like Same, for example, we really are not able to build any proper functionality into the language model. There's not enough text. And the Same language is too different from nynorsk and bokmål to benefit from the information we have about these languages. So there are problems ahead, but still we believe this is a fantastic way of building technology for practical use. Thank you.
For my images to pop up, I'm from a company called Thaulow.AI, which is a large AI consultancy and product development company based in Helsinki, but with offices in other places as well. Here we go. Let's see if this... There we go, yeah. So we have a large staff of research-oriented engineers building things for our customers. There we go, that's the one I want to have up. And we build machinery for large corporations and smallish corporations and government agencies, mostly in the Nordics, but not exclusively in the Nordics, almost exclusively in Europe, but not entirely exclusively in Europe. So this is, we have a broad experience in building things that are AI-ish. And we believe ourselves to be the largest AI corporation in Europe. This is difficult to assess, but it's not patently untrue. Now, the thing is, the important thing I want to stress is something the previous speakers have said, but I would like to say it with even more emphasis. And an LLM is not a product. An LLM is essentially useless unless it's hooked up to stuff that makes it useful. The path from a wonderful, brilliant LLM, or indeed any cutting-edge research product, output of research, going from there to something commercially and industrially useful is, I mean, I would hesitate to say that it's you're less than halfway when you have the LLM whirring and ticking along on your desk in the lab. There's plenty more to do, and this circle here is a somewhat concise expression of the effect of the different processes we do and the effort we put into making them. So, it's not just building a base model, it's doing a lot of other things as well. Now, we're currently training, and this is sort of what I was invited to say, and I'll spend one slide on it because it's very similar to what's been said by the others. We're building a large language model, or a series of large language models, to a great extent inspired by what has been done at AI Sweden and some other places. And we're building this whole series. We're currently building I think we're now building something with 33 billion parameters is the current one, and it's built to do Finnish, English, and program code with a very large token set, larger than the previous ones mentioned. But we'll get to that in a little bit. And we mostly do monolingual data, which is something to think about. It's not that one has translations to teach the model what the correspondences are between languages. It's, you know, you pour in some Danish stuff and some Swedish stuff and some Faroese stuff, and it does pretty well. And there's a lesson right there, and that's to put some of you at ease thinking about the Sami language. The thing is, as a typological linguist, a typologically oriented linguist, I'm happy to say that the differences between human languages are hugely exaggerated. We can look at the historical development of languages and say, look, this language is entirely unrelated to that language, and that is patently untrue, because languages have contact and they behave more or less the same way. When you struggled to learn French, you didn't have to learn how to greet people. You needed to learn how to greet people in French. Languages are very, very similar, so you don't need to have the same amount of data in every language you want the model to work with. So if you have a smidgen of data in South Sami, that'll help, and you probably would do better if you had more. But if you have a model that's well-trained in some languages, you can add languages to it. And we see cross-lingual benefits already during training with 2 languages. So pouring in more of another language improves what it knows in the first language, even when we're not adding stuff to it. This is, you know, an important thing. But as previous speakers have noted, lack of quality testing that is relevant to each language is a huge bottleneck. Now, this is again something to stress the fact that building products, the blue box over there, that's the base model. That's what we've been talking about most of this day. And as others have said, there's plenty more to be done. You need to collect the right data, not just the data to train the model, data to instruct the model, data that aligns the model with the customer expectations and tailors it to the needs of the downstream user. We need to fine-tune it continuously. We need to build things that make it useful. The entire structure, you know, trivial stuff in some sense, databases, authorization paths, token counts, billing systems and things. We have more people employed doing that sort of stuff than doing the actual LLM work. And this is something you need to think about. As said again by previous speakers, pouring 1 billion crowns into research will produce research. Sure, we will get wonderful research reports, but that will not translate into products. What will translate into products? I think it's what we in Swedish would call beställarkompetens. Telling your agencies what they need to ask. Something we heard in the first session today was that 1/3 of the business was business to customer, 1/3 was business to business, and by inference, the third is largely public agencies to citizens. That's a huge business, and that's where we can apply political pressure to raise their expectations of what they can get. That's a pretty good customer. This is me speaking as a commercial person here. So what we do, we have use cases. We build business-to-business co-pilots where we work with sales support. Those are in-house tools to increase the productivity of people who talk to customers. This is a easy picking where finding the right thing, essentially this is enterprise search, but enterprise search that works. It didn't used to work for those of you who, sorry if anyone here built enterprise search previously, but it really didn't work. And so business to customer is sort of in the works. It's not really trustworthy enough yet, but we're getting there. I mean, we as a field, not we as a company, there are pilots out there and we're getting there. And healthcare, as mentioned in the first session, is at top of mind for many of our customers. Many customers in healthcare are really looking for this because it's an information-dense area of human endeavor. But I would like to spend a few minutes on some of the more general challenges, again, echoing or emphasizing what has been said before. We need data. The best and most important stuff that we know as humans have been put into books for the past few hundred years. We've stored the important things in text, in writing. And in the Nordics, we're really good at saving stuff. We have archives and we have libraries. We have huge repositories of stuff, and through a stroke of luck, most of them haven't been burnt by bad people during the past few hundred years, so most of them are still there. But those archives and libraries believe that part of their business is to make those available, and part of their business is to make them unavailable. And we need to put political pressure on them from the outside world that, open the vaults, make things happen. Copyright was mentioned by several speakers here, and I'm sort of a radical personally in that respect, but I would invite even those of you who believe in the sanctity of ownership of ideas to think, do you believe copyright will look the same 50 years from now? If you do, fine, but I'll bet most of you don't. Let's speed up the process of making ideas more shareable than less shareable. This is, again, a political question, not something for most of us in this room, but for some of us in this room to think about and deliberate about. We need to help the legal system unlock copyright, not dig their heels in. Because obviously there are large interests in place to keep copyright exactly as it is. And that's as it should be, because there's a business there, right? And I don't fault people who live off copyright for wanting to preserve it, but we know it will change. Or we might as well be part of that change instead of, picketing outside libraries hoping for them to change by themselves, because they won't. They need external pressure to do this. And this is something on all of us to make the right noises to help archives unlock what's there, because that is a truly Nordic competitive edge. We can do something interesting there. We should also remember that, and this was again said by one of the speakers, or a couple of the speakers earlier today, we're not at the end of history. This is not where we, throw everything aside and build large language models. Research will continue and engineering will continue. There'll be new things ahead, and very quickly we know that we will not be happy enough with pure symbol game language models. Language is not a chess game. We need to have context and intentions. There will be more on the path to truly intelligent language use. Things will happen very soon, and they will not be the same architecture as today. And this is well known in the research field and in the development field. But we should keep this in mind when we plan our national programs. Let's not plan a 4-year program that will roll out today's truth as a product 4 years from now. That's not useful. And be prepared for speech, because this will happen very soon. It's already happening, but we're not talking about it in this room. Spoken models that understand speech and produce speech will happen with their own challenges. More data, essentially more data initiatives will be needed, more archives to unlock. And I guess probably final challenge here is that we need to think about what quality tests are relevant. I've been researching lately what quality tests are used to train models. Most of them are taken off shelves, built by researchers such as me for previous purposes, and they're maybe not the most important ways to test the quality of a system. We need to generate new quality tests. And what are those quality tests encoding? I looked at one quality test that's used by, I know it's used by Magnus' team, I know it's used by our team in collaboration with Turku, and I suspect it's used in Norway, which is Hellaswag, which is a very popular test. It's a really cool test. You give the system a little bit of text and ask it to complete it, or select from several completions. It's actually an intelligent test. I fully approve of the test itself, but I sampled out 3 questions. Truly randomly, I picked some questions out of it. These are the questions. Do they encode stuff that's at the top of mind for the Nordic environment? I'm not sure that it does. I mean, these are relevant in some sense for the general human experience, but, cowboying around and throwing lassos, maybe we should have something about rowing boats, There's stuff there that can be improved. What's on a typical breakfast table, right? If we talk about pancakes and bacon, we're not in the Nordics. I mean, I like pancakes as much as the next man. So we need to do stuff here. And this is not an academic test. It's not an academic challenge. It's not an industrial challenge. It's something we need to do together. But also we should remember that this is fun. We should not furrow our brows and think about what are the risks and how can we fund this. The main draw of getting people to work with this is that it's hugely entertaining, delightful, joyful. It's really cool to work with AI. And I think most of us in this room are here because of that, not because we're worried, but the general sense of speaking about AI out in the world is, what are we going to do with this monster? Let's make sure that we produce fun side effects from what we do, and we roll out interesting and fun things. If we're doing stuff in the Nordics, let's make stuff that everyone likes, because that will help us going along. Oh yeah, that was all I intended to say. Then I was asked, and I was happy to see that earlier we mentioned the Nordic State of AI report. The 3rd edition is coming out, and we're looking for contributions to it. So if you think you have some insights or learnings to share, come up to me afterwards and I'll put you in touch with the editor. That was all I intended to say. Thank you.
Nice to be here together with all of you. My name is Agnes Stenbom, and I run InLab, which is a joint innovation lab by Schibsted and our owner foundation, the Tinius Trust. I'm also an industrial PhD candidate at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, where I do research on AI and journalism. Today, unlike the previous speakers, I'm not here to present a language model or give you policy recommendations on the challenges of that work. Rather, I'm here to provide one look at why it's so exciting that this infrastructure is being built and what the opportunities that might provide to fields like journalism could be. Specifically, I want to give you a brief comment from the work that we do at InLab and our focus on news outsiders. According to the Reuters News Institute in Oxford, 32% of my countrymen, the Swedes, avoided news last year. Frequently cited reasons for this is that we feel like the news makes us feel bad. We feel stressed, even angry by consuming it. We feel like the news are repetitive, and we specifically, or most often, opt out of news concerning politics and war. 2 types of news that I think we are very much in need of right now. If we look at a specific group of consumers, residents in Sweden's crime-ridden, multicultural outer city areas, we can see that 48% of that group shows this same behavior. The reasons for news avoidance are similar, but they're even more motivated by these negative effects on your mental health. This number also resonates global trends, where you can see how a lower level of socioeconomic status and a relative lack of socio-cultural capital makes you a more likely news avoider. It's not hard to see the risks that proposes to the democratic conversation, where parts of the population remain or poorly informed by the fourth estate. Some of you may wonder what those numbers have to do with Nordic language models. And while the link might not be obvious to all of you, it sure is to me. Because I think it's very important that we recognize how even social challenges could be met by the emergence of new technological opportunities. If we spend social resources on understanding the problem, we can also use technical solutions to meet them. I see an undeniable link between these contemporary investments in Nordic LLMs that we've just heard about and the opening up of new opportunities for fields such as my own. And with that comes opportunities to explore novel formats, new types of products, and possibly ways to engage audiences that we are currently not reaching. Journalism has met audiences in fairly similar ways during the past centuries. Kristin told you that we have a long-standing tradition in the company that we work for. While we do a lot of great things, I think it's important to recognize how innovation has typically followed the trajectory of the printed newspaper, where we've repurposed the written word to new formats and to fit screens of various sizes. I think it's important that we recognize that this might not be the future. There might be other formats for us to explore, other ways for the news to meet publics. At InLab, we think it's important that we explore radically different futures. We think it's important that we explore possible directions for our field to take. We need to explore, get to know future scenarios that are desirable, things that we want, but also undesirable, things that we worry might happen, but that we need to understand so that we can have an informed conversation about which path to follow. Our method of doing this, of exploring possible futures, is primarily co-creation. We invite the target groups that today stand far away from us into a co-creative process where we together try to understand lived problems and explore solutions on how to meet those. Here you're seeing images from one of those programs. We called it the News 2030 Hackathon, where we invited young tech and design profiles from outer city areas in Stockholm to join us to explore what the future of journalism could look like in 2030. Their ideas included an AI-powered sentiment adjustment system where you in real time should be able to control the sentiment of the news that you're consuming. It also included an always-on-demand AI news buddy, a person that you could call and ask whatever questions you might have about the news. We read about Israel and Palestine, but what is the two-state solution? We hear about the NATO progress, but what is NATO really? Having a person, an AI buddy, that you could ask these questions could make the news more understandable. Another example is our News Changemaker program. This was a longer effort where we invited 10 young adults aged 15 to 19 from the crime-ridden area of Hallonbergen. This is one of the areas that you're seeing on the news a lot these days, where we have a lot of shootings and young people involved in criminal activities. These young adults worked with us in a 10-week program, a co-creative process, where we together sought to meet some of the challenges that they saw with today's news reporting. The ideas that came out of this program echoed a lot of what was ideated in the News 2030 project, but they had even greater focus on mental health. They proposed a solution that they called a news therapist, an AI avatar that should be on demand to help you deal with any emotions awoken from news consumption. Another idea that they had asked a quite straightforward question. What would happen if the news came through music? Yesterday we learned about the progress recently made within AI and generative music models, and I think it's fun to explore what those opportunities give, what kind of opportunities that gives to fields such as mine. This spring, we paired up with the biggest newspaper in the Nordics, Aftonbladet, one of our Schibsted brands, to build a service that gave you news as music. We built on the idea from the young changemakers and crafted a prototype news service that went live to all of Aftonbladet's users, where you could consume the news either as a written text with a theme song, an instrumental tune based on the content of the article that strengthened your experience of that theme, and also AI-generated rap songs. And news as AI raps might sound like a gimmick, and people tend to laugh when I tell them about this example, but it's interesting to see when we test this service live on users, but also in focus groups with those who are far away from us today, those stories really resonate. And as a consumer of this product myself, I can remember the content of those raps that we posted 4 months ago, but I can barely remember what I read this morning while scrolling the news while having my coffee. Music sticks. We've always told stories through music, so why couldn't we tell the news through it as well? What all of the ideas that came out of these or come out of these programs that we run have in common is that they take technology for granted. They build on technology that today is not here. They don't talk about AI or LLMs. They don't use the terminology that we use in this room today. To them, it's just infrastructure. It's as natural to them as the internet or social media. Somewhere underneath all of these creative user interfaces that they want to see in the future, there are information models, language models, sorting, ranking, indexing, evaluating, reformatting information for them. And they trust that this will be done in safe and robust ways. I told you that they leverage technology that is not here today. I think it's interesting to see how the young people that we work with have a great sense of optimism towards the developments that we are all working with. They ideate services that presuppose technological improvements. They ideate services that use technology that we today are afraid to build large-scale services upon because we worry about technical limitations, ethical considerations, or questions that we don't have answers to, or where there are regulative processes that have so much uncertainty that we worry what implementing the tools in practice could mean for us long-term. But these young changemakers that we work with, they trust us to sort that all out. They trust us to enable these products that they want to see in the future. They say with certainty that technology will be good enough. Today's meeting is titled Nordic Perspectives on Artificial Intelligence. And with this brief comment from InLab, I hope to have given you a perspective from young Swedes who have high expectations on the technology we're discussing, but also on people such as yourself to take responsibility for building safe and robust infrastructure for them to enjoy down the line. Thanks.
Thank you for being here. I'm grateful for that opportunity. So now we're going to move from the opportunities with generative AI to regulation of generative AI. It's a less sexy topic, but it will constitute the framework for the possibilities that we have ahead of us. My name is Sööder, and as Kristin said, I work as a public policy manager for Schibsted. That means that my job is to influence coming regulation that will have an impact on Schibsted's businesses, and that is usually everything from media policy, marketplace regulation, regulation of fintech services, etc. But these days, it's all about AI and AI regulation, and then mainly the AI Act. This world-unique attempt at introducing a horizontal regulation of the use of AI is now being negotiated in Brussels as we speak at a very fast pace. The aim is to finalize the negotiations before the end of this year, but there are still some very big issues left to be resolved. However, they do need to seal this before the upcoming EU elections. Otherwise, they need to postpone the negotiations till the end, or till October next year, and nobody really wants that. So, the call for regulation of AI, and especially generative AI, comes from many different actors. On the one side, we have Sam Altman from OpenAI and Sundar Pichai from Google. These guys have both been out on sort of a global crusade calling for more regulation of AI and especially generative AI. Why? Is it because they want to be perceived as good guys? Is it a brand-building exercise? Probably yes and yes to those questions, but it's also mainly because they really do want to have rules in place. They do not want to end up in the same situation as we had with the social networks, getting a lot of criticism for not handling problems arising on their platforms. Then on the other sides, we have Commissioner Breton and Commissioner Vestager, who have both initiated voluntary initiatives on generative AI, such as the AI Pact, which is being discussed together with the big tech companies, and the AI Code of Conduct, which is being discussed between EU and US at the moment. The motive for these initiatives is that they don't think we can wait until we have the AI Act entered into force in 2026. We need rules now. And there's also an upcoming election that might have something to do with this. And we heard, about other initiatives, global initiatives. We have the G7 countries, etc., discussing this. So there's a lot of things happening on the field of regulating AI at the moment. Sorry. When you hear this, you get the sense, that there's no rules and regulation in place. Somebody already said that today. We have a lot of rules that apply also to this AI sphere. This is just to mention a few of them. But, we're still at a very early phase in this technical shift. So we don't know how to enforce all of these rules in this new AI landscape. So do we need any more rules? Maybe we do. But there is, of course, a certain regulatory uncertainty at this moment. It could be good to remind ourselves that we have rules. Okay, over to the AI Act. I know for certain that many of you in this room are more than experts on the AI Act, but for those of you who maybe aren't, The AI Act aims at regulating the use of AI. It's not intended to be a product regulation, and it is based on a risk-based approach, meaning the more risk the use of an AI system entails, the more obligations for providers and users of these AI systems to fulfill. Some AI systems are presenting unacceptable risks, so they are proposed to be prohibited, such as system for social scoring and also system including facial recognition in public spaces. And this last point, the biometric data, is actually the most difficult disagreement in the negotiations at the moment. On the one hand, we have the parliament that completely wants to forbid facial recognition in CCTV, and then we have, on the other hand, the member states that think that the responsibility for national security and law enforcement lies within the member states. The proposal also lists a wide range of high-risk use cases of AI systems, cases in which AI systems are allowed to be used, but if you use them and put them on the market, you need to comply with a broad list of rules, including a very extensive risk assessment procedure, and also to register this AI system in an EU database. And high-risk use cases include AI systems used within education, recruitment, access to essential private and public services, law enforcement, etc. These are very broad categories of high-risk use. And one of the other very big issues at the moment, I would say the million-dollar questions on the table, is how to actually frame what constitutes high risk. How can we make this regulation granular and really target the really risky use cases within all of these very broad categories? And then there's also some AI systems that only present a limited risk, and they are proposed to be subject to some transparency obligations. And those are, for instance, when you use an AI system as a chatbot in a customer service, or when you produce a deep fake. Then you need to inform individuals that the content here was produced by an AI. And I'm very certain that everybody on the internet that's producing and spreading deep fakes will be very compliant with the AI Act once it enters into force. This is a slide that really gives away that I'm a lawyer, but you don't have to read it all. My apologies. The brief today was actually to talk about the regulation of LLMs and generative AI. But the timing of this talk is actually not the best, since we do not know anything of the outcomes of the negotiations yet. But I'll try to give you some sort of flavor of what they are discussing at the moment. And we should bear in mind that LLMs are kind of special in this context, because they are designed, to be, or they are designed for multiple purpose use. You don't know from the outset what this model will be used for further down the line. And therefore, it's rather hard to frame them within this risk-based approach that they are proposing. So, okay. When this proposal came in April 2021, it did not entail or include any specific rules on generative AI or LLMs. Then last year, when the member states were deciding on their position, they included some rules, specific rules, for what they called general-purpose AI systems, which encompass LLMs and generative AI models. And their take to regulate these LLMs were to say, if they are used within high-risk use cases, for instance, if you use an LLM for recruitment, then you should have some sort of rules relating to that. However, if you were a provider of this type of general-purpose AI system, and you wrote in your instruction, my system is not intended for high-risk use, then you should not have so much rules on regulations and obligations. Then, all of a sudden, ChatGPT happened, it became the talk of the town, and most of the discussions in the European Parliament were all about how should we regulate generative AI? How should we regulate these bots? And those discussions ended up in very specific and far-reaching rules on what they called or framed as foundational models. And this is just sort of tip of the iceberg of the list of obligations on foundational models. They're leaning more towards how these models should be designed, meaning they're leaning more towards a product regulation in this proposal. And they were also saying that these rules should apply irrespective of how your LLM is supposed to be used. You should have a very long list of administrative and very burdensome rules, irrespective of if your LLM is no risk at all. So they were also stepping away from this, the idea behind the proposal, the risk-based approach. The EU institutions are now having very intense discussions on how to regulate these types of AI systems that are designed for multiple purposes. Because, as I said, even if they're not intended for high-risk use, then maybe they will be used for that further down the line. Maybe then we should have some form of basic set of rules, but at what level and for what type of actor in this AI value chain? And also, what type of information should you be obliged to present to others so they can build on your model? That's a very important issue as well. And also, how should we handle open source in all of this? And they're down to the fact that, what are we even going to call this in the regulation? So, and also, the most important thing is, this will be entered into force in 2 years. And as someone said here today, how do we create a legislation that is actually fit for future? So they are discussing this now. They had a meeting last week, and according to the talk of the town, there is some form of compromise proposal from the Commission. They're trying to pull everybody back to this risk-based approach, but we don't know anything about the details of the solution at the moment, so we'll have to get back to that. The joint message from most European companies, we're working together with many private companies to sort of influence this legislation, is to please preserve this risk-based approach also when it comes to regulating the LLMs. We need this in order to be able to innovate. It's a very important message from the companies of Europe. We cannot have overly burdensome administrative obligations. Irrespective of high risk, low risk, whatever risk, we will all have to make a very extensive risk assessment, and we would have done so either way. But we should not, for instance, be obliged to register our LLM in an EU database just to state that, look at this model, it is not constituted, it is not a significant risk for harm. Then we risk spending more money on compliance than on innovation until we outsource compliance to the AI bots. And we also risk EU to lag behind in this global tech race, as we heard the message today. And this is a message that we really hope that the policymakers in Brussels is listening to. Please do not overregulate us. Please let us innovate. My time is up here, so just to summarize, this is a very complex and unclear piece of legislation at the moment. We tried to run it through Claude to get a clearer idea of what this actually means, but even chatbot Claude could not give us any clarification on this. He had a hard time assessing it. And this hopefully also means that AI lawyers will be needed for at least 2 more years till we have a regulation in place. So happy to answer the questions that you might have in the lunch break. Thank you for your time.
Though would like to first set the scene, the backdrop, where from certain things started and where the high-level expert group of AI actually was asked to do the ethical guidelines and then policy and investment recommendations where from this risk-based approach stemmed from. And then a few observations and thoughts on regulation in general. But I think it's Melvin Gransberg said already, 1986, the technology is neither good nor bad, but it's nor neutral. And I think that neutrality, having now quite wide range, is creating a major tension and difficulty when we apply that to AI. Earlier already it was mentioned that there are very different kind of ways of framing how the regulations should be built and where to derive from. In the US, it's market-driven innovation first, culture. China, it is the nation first, country-based. Europe, clearly regulation-driven and human centricity based. And then we have the first world and third world distinction where the regulation has no similar meaning when you are actually fighting for your everyday survival. The high-level expert group on AI was established 2018. 2 years we run it. We were 52 experts. We needed to do ethical guidelines and then the policy and investment recommendations. And it was very clear in the beginning that we needed to reflect the European values, and therefore the ethical guidelines started from the human centricity. And therefore the overarching goal was to create a trustworthy AI, which can be then lawful, ethical, and technically robust in simple terms, with the aim to maximize the benefits of AI and at the same time mitigate and eliminate the risks and the downsides of using AI. So that kind of innovation and regulation balance was there. When the trustworthy AI was then actually built, developed, the concept of that, there were 7 key requirements, and you will find these requirements in multiple of statements nowadays, and those 7 requirements represent a wide range of elements. First, human agency and oversight. Secondly, technical robustness and safety. Then privacy and data governance. Transparency. Fifth, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness. Sixth, the environmental and societal well-being, and then the 7th is accountability. Commission gave a communication on this, and in Commission's language, that means that this is now embraced by the full Commission and different DGs. So that became the basis for the work. The other investment and policy part, what we did, having 52 people, having extremely high diversity from human rights to industries, from ethicists to professors in the deep tech, we were very much afraid how could we actually come with something where we could agree on the approach on regulation. But it was surprising how united we were, that the only way to regulate AI is a risk-based approach. That was signed by everyone. And that was also then picked by EU. And as Anna, you said, we really need to stick to that. If we are, whatever is the area, if that is lost, then we don't have a scale, or we don't have a skeleton against which we can have intellectually honest debate on matters. Then the politicking will take place. So therefore, that would be, I would fully support and second that particular element. It was interesting how these things, how they come about. GDPR took 6 years. Now this will be probably 5 years for this. Ethical guidelines out spring 2019, Commission's white paper 20, then the AI Act first version from Commission 21, then Council added 22, and now Parliament 23. 3 versions are different. Now the Commission, luckily it's a Commission which is the broker here. So it's a 3-party discussion, but they are trying to create the compromise, and they are probably having the biggest common sense how this could be then made practical and not having the overall burden. Anna went through the categories. Those 4 ones, now the last one is less important actually. The 4th one is the generative AI. And the list is long, it's a downstream element. And it will be very interesting, and this is now English interesting, very interesting for big tech companies to comply those requirements. That's hugely burdensome. And that's a question, so what will be the power struggle between Commission and the big tech companies that they would then kind of work in Europe if those are the obligations or requirements imposed on them to be clarified. I think the unacceptable risks are relatively simple. There is the face recognition as an example, which is interesting, and the law enforcement is there. The high risk is the element. That is probably the thing where we all should really pay attention how that will be interpreted. There are 2 years' time when we are applying it now, and that is for standards to be established, and that is for the nation or national legislators to create the enforcement capability. And also during that time there will be guidelines on the grey areas, because there will be a number of grey areas where you need to have a different discussion. And I would tend to believe that the high-risk definition, are you within the high risk or not, will be one of the most critical ones. And coming back to the cooperation between companies in certain industries and understanding the context specificity, which should be key here when this high risk is defined. It would be great if those companies could join their forces in fighting the right kind of interpretation or clarification within the grey areas. Because even though there's very little you can do now to influence the final AI Act, it's the council we can somehow influence. If you know the parliament members who are in powerful positions, you can maybe influence, but it will be then the next phase when this interpretation within the grey areas will take place. That is the point where the act should be pulled together. So I skipped those things. What are the requirements? They were explained. No reason to go back there. There's one element, one thing which we also should be aware of is that in order to have a quality legislation, you need time. And now that the Spanish presidency is coming to an end, is actually in Brussels felt negatively. So under the time pressure, if those critical decisions are made, there's a danger that we have a low-quality legislation on certain critical areas. One critical area which is open is the AI definition. That is not defined. So how all frameworks are there, but then what is the thing which is put in that box? OECD is in a key role. Now, Commission is waiting the OECD's definition on AI, and probably the biggest debate will be taking place how the algorithmic systems where they belong. So deep expert systems and the deep learnings will be there. There's another thing which comes back to the approach for regulation, and there has been a criticism. Some people have said that this is a very odd piece of regulation, because this piece of regulation is regulating the means, not the ends. And if you would like to take a comparison, you could use certain pure mathematical models, for example, in the area of biometrics, to have exactly the same results what you would have with AI. So this is now regulating the AI, not what is done with the technology. And that might be one of the areas to be really thought carefully going forward, that can you regulate fast-moving AI? Should you instead regulate the end results? And then, if that is the case, then the whole question that what does the existing legislation already regulates, that becomes relevant. And therefore, those discussions on the regulatory approach and the whole framing should be conducted. That's a fundamental question here. It is the first regulation in the world. US will not come with the regulation. US has the voluntary commitment, and that focuses on research, not behavioral side. If you would like to have a US-wide regulation on companies, it would need to be then established in Congress. No way. You may have a state-based. GDPRS was adopted very, very fast in California, so California might be the first, maybe not, to have a say on here. Let me finish with few remarks on how to regulate. I think EU should be, and we have the right to ask that EU would be the wisest regulator on earth. In that way, it could be a competitive advantage for European businesses. But then, if you are the wisest regulator in the world, you really need to understand the phenomenon. You need to go deep in the granularity. You need to understand what to regulate, when to regulate, and how to regulate. I don't know how well you know the regulation toolbox EU has. It's actually a very wide toolbox of different regulatory instruments. Black letter law on one end, and then voluntary assessments on one end, sandboxes, number of different things there. Really would wish that EU would use widely this regulatory toolbox in different areas of AI regulation, and therefore get more granular and wiser. Digital economy is difficult to regulate, and in one way even probably more difficult to put that in or enforce it in a meaningful manner. And within the digital economy, AI is a very special element. We all have said that AI is moving fast, but I think that it's almost a sensation that the speed of the development is only accelerating. And in a human life, there are very few areas where you can even conceptually think that the speed is still accelerating. The faster you go, the higher the acceleration. The only thing I can come up with is the Formula 1 acceleration, because from 0 to 100, the acceleration is this. From 100 to 200, the acceleration is faster. And the first part of after 200 is even higher acceleration. But that is inhuman to think. And AI is doing that. So how on earth we can regulate that one? And the question is, there are so many, we don't know what we don't know. And if the regulation takes 5 years, that's ouch. And therefore, different approaches need to be applied. The second thing, and particularly for our Europeans, on the how to regulate part, we should think how we make sure that the regulation will help, will support, probably will even provide a level playing field for all of us. Avoiding the dominance, avoiding the lock-in, avoiding elements where lack of competition would actually distort the level playing field. Not easy, but that is part of the remit of regulation as well. And then the third thing on regulation, we should always have the right to demand good quality regulation, where we understand what is regulated, it's clear, And that, whether we like it or not, but we know what is within the regulation and how that is regulated. And with AI, that will be difficult, and that will be a burdensome, that is an overhead, and I'm afraid that there will be elements, as much as we need the regulation, the byproduct will be that innovation will suffer in certain areas. For us, if we think then the regulator's task in Brussels, and when I followed the work, the people in Brussels in general work extremely hard, and they have the capabilities, but they are not that many. If you would know how many people were actually drafting the initial white paper and the AI Act 2020, 2021, that is a very small group of people, and they weren't experts in AI. They use the network, but they also need to think, who can I trust? Who is my confidant when I ask an expert opinion? That can that be unbiased? And therefore, when we think the future steps of regulation as Scandinavians or Nordic countries, we should probably think that the way to influence, this is too late now, the way to influence is that we influence early, we find the way to get connected, but the only way how we can do the influence is that we are relevant. We are intellectually honest and we are relevant in our work. With that, just building on what Anna said. Thank you.
Well, this more or less panned out as expected. Lunch is served outside. Most of the points on regulation were covered by Anna and Pekka. But just to begin with the arrangement last night, I talked to a few people. The first person I talked to said that this AI Act should be scrapped. That will probably not happen. The second said we're not taking negotiations in Brussels seriously enough from member states. And of course, I see it a bit differently. Denmark actually engaged with the Commission before the AI Act was proposed. We worked quite closely with the like-minded countries. We contributed to the risk-based approach described by Pekka and Anna with the D9 countries back in 2020. And in the negotiations, we paid particular attention to narrowing and clarifying the definition of AI, as Pekka actually talked about. There are very many, as you know, automatic systems that's been used for a long time. They do not pose a new risk. So we need the regulation to focus on what I call the real AI, the autonomous systems that can infer new outcomes they were not hard-coded to do. Last week, in the OECD by Ulrich, an agreement was, a preliminary agreement was reached on an updated definition on AI. It introduces inference in the definition, and it maintains the reference to autonomy. And we expect that this will be reflected also in the EU definition on the grounding for the AI Act. Another vital element is the horizontal risk assessment. AI systems, they are used within high-risk areas, for example, in a hospital. But if they're used for a routine task, maybe shutting on or off the lights in the hallway, they should, of course, not be covered by this act. So it's quite important that we get the risk categorization right, that we, in that way, avoid slowing down innovation more than we need to, especially for this quite boring but effective AI. We have worked quite hard to clarify the use cases in the high-risk annex. Only systems used within essential public services should be categorized as high risk. We could talk about things like parking licenses. They are a public service, of course, but they are hardly a problem for fundamental rights. Finally, there's the question of the governance structure. It needs to be robust. We cannot enforce rules. If we cannot enforce the rules, they will not make a difference. We believe that that Europe actually needs some kind of enforcement in the large cross-border cases, for example, with the ChatGPT. This could be modeled on the Digital Service Act that actually gives powers to enforce in case of widespread infringements that pose a systemic risk. And this could be seen as a supplement to the national enforcement. As my two previous speakers have said now, we are in the very final stage of negotiations. Last week, we had the third political trilogue. On October 24, we'll have the probably last, possibly last would be more precise. Progress last week was not as big as many of us had hoped for. There's a lot still on the table. It seems very ambitious if the Spanish presidency will be able to solve it all in one meeting. So we actually expect one more meeting will be needed. But we do expect that a solution will be found before the next Telecoms Council meeting in early December. The main outstanding questions are prohibitions and the law enforcement authorities. It's how the rules will apply to general purpose AI systems and foundation models, as you heard before, and it's the governance structure. When it comes to prohibitions and law enforcement authorities, the Council has very limited flexibility. We expect that the European Parliament will end up allowing many of the prohibitions to be moved to high risk. And, of course, they will do this, they will take a price for this to accept those exemptions. Parliament is very attached to the inclusion of foundation models. From the Danish side, we agree that the final provider cannot carry the full burden in this market structure, and we understand the wish for imposing requirements on the large, powerful foundation models that we talked about. But it's not in line with the risk-based approach to impose requirements on all foundation models. Also, we heard that before. This could stifle innovation, hinder development of models like the one that Schibsted is actually developing. A possible compromise will need to include clear criteria to distinguish between the large and powerful foundation models from other foundation models, like the DSA did with the very large online platforms. Finally, on governance, broader coverage could maybe be coupled with enforcement by giving the European Parliament suggested AI office the power to enforce towards general purpose AI systems and foundation models. Maybe this is just Danish wishful thinking, but that's how we could see it end up. October 24 will be quite an intense AI day. We'll soon know where all this will land. I'm sure the AI Act will not be scrapped, and I'm sure that we will continue to negotiate with all that we have in order to reach a good agreement. Lunch is served outside, I'm sure, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Anna, Pekka, and Sophus. And just to that last point, I mean, it would be crazy if, for example, companies like us participating in generating these models will be punished in a way of then being regulated much more severely. So I'm very happy to hear you acknowledge that, and I wish your voice will be heard all over, Sophus.